If you're taking on the role of being a director, you've signed up for a big task.
Making sure companies are paying for performance is the biggest challenge facing compensation committees today.
Emerging markets are going to create challenges for all global companies.
Corporate Board Member presents the Board Governance Series with series contributors PricewaterhouseCoopers, Meridian Compensation Partners, and Clifford Chance. On this edition of the Board Governance Series, why transformational transactions are important to boards, with Catherine Bramall, partner, PricewaterhouseCoopers Center for Board Governance.
Welcome to the Board Governance Series. I'm T.K. Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and it's my pleasure to be dealing with an important topic today on why transformational transactions are important to boards. And my guest on today's Board Governance Series show is Catherine Bramall, who is the partner for the Center of Board Governance for PwC. And Catherine, welcome.
Thank you, TK.
I know that PwC likes to put out a publication called Board Effectiveness, What Works Best for Boards. And I know it's a practical guide to help directors with to be a more effective board, and you've solicited insights from a lot of governance experts across the land. And one of the issues that you deal with in the book is transformational transactions. So my first question is obviously going to be, what is a transformational transaction? And then why do directors need to focus on them?
Sure. Well, transformational transactions are the major mergers or acquisitions or other sort of joint ventures that companies get into that are material and strategic. It also could include divestitures, a major divestiture of a business. It's sort of an interesting environment we're in right now. Companies have amassed a great deal of cash on their balance sheets. So particularly mergers and acquisitions, more companies are looking at them. That said, we also know that for the most part, or many mergers and acquisitions don't actually return the shareholder value that everyone had hoped when they were approved and entered into. And so it is an area where there's a lot of potential risk. And the other element we know is that very often after a merger or acquisition is announced, there's the announcement of a lawsuit. And so these are areas where directors are concerned that not only do they want to make sure that any big transactions do add shareholder value, but also that their own processes sort of protect them in the event there is some kind of challenge or question to what they've done in the boardroom.
Knowing all the challenges and risks that are involved in these transactions, is there any particular structure that people expect management to follow?
Sure. In many ways, there are frameworks for how these can work well. And I guess sort of starting at the very start, maybe the two elements to keep in mind are the objectives for the transaction and what we call the non-negotiable deal drivers. And in terms of the objectives, it's really important that any potential transaction truly align with the company's strategy. So is it a strategy to get new technology, or will it bring entry into new markets? But whatever elements there are in a potential deal, they really do need to feed in and support the company's strategy. Now, when we talk about the non-negotiable deal drivers, what we really mean by those are, what are the things that say we're talking about an acquisition, that the acquisition must have or must avoid at all cost. And so, for example, if we're talking about the must-haves, you may have your non-negotiables include things like, if we're going to acquire a company, it's got to be either number 1 or 2 in the market. Or if we're going to acquire a company, we need to make sure that we're going to keep at least 90% of the customer base, be able to retain it post-transaction. In terms of what do we have to avoid, you may want to avoid scenarios where there is incredible customer concentration in the companies, so that, say, one customer makes up 30% of the company's revenue. Or you also may set as a non-negotiable to avoid companies where there are potentially significant corruption issues or lawsuits underway. One of the nice things about having those things like objectives and non-negotiables defined up front, even before you get into considering a transaction, is it helps management maintain the discipline to not just get enamored and engaged in a potential transaction, which are always fun, but to keep coming back to the basics and the philosophy and be able to very early on, if something doesn't meet particularly the non-negotiables, to just sort of walk away and look for another opportunity.
The term transformational transaction sounds sort of daunting, but yeah. I would expect that almost every company will have these transactions in front of them at some time during their business career or their business cycle. So what are the other things that sort of directors should keep as top of mind?
Well, once management does have a target, say, that does meet the strategic objectives and hits through all of the non-negotiable deal drivers, the question becomes, what kind of due diligence should directors be looking to management to perform? And the due diligence, I guess the nature of the due diligence should really depend on the risks and the importance of the transaction. So the degree of due diligence, the riskier and the more important the transaction, the more due diligence as a director you would expect to see. But the due diligence at the end of the day should be identifying the issues and the opportunities and providing a good assessment so the company really understands what it's looking at. And those issues may be anything from what kind of compliance issues or tax issues may there be, just to what kinds of opportunities, and really, say you're buying technology, is the technology really everything you think it will be? The other element that we've seen work really well with the whole area of overseeing transformational transactions is for the board to actually be engaged in more of an ongoing dialogue with the management team. It's never ideal for the management team to come to the board in a board meeting and say, by the way, we just saw this great acquisition, but we need to act fast and let's approve it, it's okay. Really, instead, where I've seen it work really well is when management or the company is on an acquisition road, for there to be ongoing dialogue with the board, meeting by meeting, that really describes for the board and engages in a dialogue around, what are the handful of companies we're looking at, and then every subsequent board meeting there's an update for the board on how the due diligence process is coming and where management's thinking is shifting. The advantage of that is it allows directors to engage with management and provide feedback early on or ask management to delve into another area. But ideally, after the board has heard about, say, company X over a period of time, by the time management's finalized its due diligence and is happy with the potential price and just with going ahead with the transaction, and they're recommending to the board that the board approve it, the board is entirely comfortable and understands. Of course, the other aspect to this is just what is management's track record. And so if you're on a board where management has a great track record of not paying too much for acquisitions and being able to integrate them well, I think that gives you a great sense of a director as to just how engaged you may want to be.
Ah, yes, communications. Isn't that funny how that keeps cropping up as a valuable tool in all these? Well, what about when a board is coming to the close of a transaction or a deal, which always ends up to be sort of a critical time? What sort of should boards be focusing on, at sort of that, what I'll call critical time?
Yeah. What boards will want to look at when the deal is just about to be finalized is management ready to integrate it? And does management understand all the elements that it needs to integrate it? How robust is the management team? One of the things we've seen over the last few years is companies downsizing and getting a little slimmer. And so one of the questions is, do you actually have the capabilities or the right advisors to help? And it's particularly critical for the integration plan to have some key, we generally say 100-day wins, because you've got to get things integrated and integrated fast. you also have the opportunity early on to dig a little more deeply into what you've bought, particularly to see if there are issues you need to address, and also to understand how to meld the two cultures, because if the tone at the top and the culture that you want in the combined company isn't established from pretty early on, one of the things we've seen is that the culture that ultimately is adopted, if there's no focus on it, may not be the culture that the board wants to see.
Well, transformational transactions is just one part of this book. How does somebody, if they're interested in the board effectiveness, what works best, how would they get their hands on this?
You can order it from our website, and essentially what the entire book does is transformational transactions is one chapter, but in other chapters we deal with other board responsibilities to do things like oversee strategy and risk management and tone at the top. So we'd welcome people to buy it or to get it from us.
Well, it's a pleasure having you, and thanks for joining us. And this sounds like a very interesting topic for anybody interested in our board governance series. Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks, TK.
Catherine Bramall can be reached at catherine.bramall@us.pwc.com. The Board Governance Series is a presentation of corporate board member in NYSE Euronext Company.